Greetings to everyone on the channel. I am Peter, better known as Father Peter. For many years, I led small parishes, offering spiritual comfort to communities often forgotten. I was never a man of uncertainty. My faith had always been my foundation. However, everything changed when I was assigned to an ancient monastery located in the mountains, far from any form of civilization. The bishop entrusted me with replacing a priest who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The building was grand, made of stones weathered by time. The nuns who welcomed me spoke rarely and made even less eye contact. There was something unsettling about the way they moved. They avoided crossing the courtyard at night and hurriedly locked the doors at dusk. No one offered any explanations for this. During the first masses, I noticed that most of the faithful seemed distant, praying without fervor, almost as if they were fulfilling a duty rather than expressing genuine faith. One early morning, I woke up to a dragging sound coming from outside my room. I waited for a while, but the sound persisted. Grabbing my lantern, I began walking through the stone corridors. The shadows cast by the candles seemed denser than usual. The absolute silence heightened my unease. Then I spotted a slightly open door at the end of the corridor. As I approached, I realized it was the entrance to the chapel. The dim candlelight illuminated the interior. Inside, a group of nuns was kneeling before the altar, whispering in a language I did not recognize. The atmosphere was suffocating. I felt like I did not belong there. When one of them raised her head and her dark eyes met mine, a chill ran down my spine, paralyzing me for a moment. She smiled, but her expression did not convey kindness. The others turned simultaneously as if they shared a single thought. The murmuring ceased and a thick silence filled the space. I should have stepped back, but something inside me signaled that it was already too late. I took a small step backward, and the door shut abruptly, echoing through the space. I called out in prayer, trying to detach myself from the fear growing within me. The air around me felt heavy, as if an invisible force was pressing against me. The nun leading the group slowly approached. Her footsteps were silent, as if she glided across the floor. She extended her hand toward my chest, and a shiver ran through me. It was as if her presence drained the vitality from the room, compelling me to act. I lifted the crucifix and began to pray. The nun hesitated for an instant. Her lips curled into a sarcastic smile. "Your faith is fragile, Father," she whispered in a hoarse voice. The candles began to flicker, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. The invisible pressure intensified, crushing my chest. I closed my eyes and continued the prayer. A sensation of suffocation started to overwhelm me. I felt something cold touch my shoulder, fingers thin like claws. When I opened my eyes, the nun was right in front of me, her face nearly pressed against mine. She tilted her head and whispered something I could not understand, but the sound made my vision momentarily black out. When I regained focus, I realized I was alone in the chapel. The nuns had disappeared, but the candles were still lit, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. I quickly left without looking back. Something was clearly very wrong in that place, and at that moment, I realized my mission would be far more complicated than I had imagined. In the following days, I observed the nuns more closely. Under certain lighting, their faces seemed to lose human features, as if they were mere outlines of something concealed. None of them were willing to discuss that night in the chapel. Whenever I tried to bring up the subject, they averted their gaze and changed the topic. One night, the Mother Superior called for me. "You should stop asking questions," she said. The warning felt like a subtle threat, but it was too late to ignore it. I decided I would conduct my own investigation. I waited until midnight and ventured into the dark corridors. The monastery seemed even larger at night. The shadows stretched in bizarre ways, and the hallways appeared to extend endlessly, in stark contrast to how they looked during the day. On the lower floor, I found a locked door. Using an old piece of iron, I forced the lock open. Inside, the air had a peculiar scent, a mixture of dampness, remnants of candles, and something metallic. The room contained a table covered with a filthy cloth and a thick book, open to a page filled with strange symbols. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. These were not prayers but rituals. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor. I turned off the lantern and hid behind an old cabinet. Through the gap in the door, I saw the Mother Superior enter, accompanied by 2 nuns. None of them carried candles or lamps, yet they seemed to see perfectly in the darkness. They approached the table and began chanting words in a language that caused a physical discomfort in me, as if blades were scraping inside my head. I clutched the crucifix and attempted to pray, but my mind was blank. These women were not merely sinners, they were something infinitely more terrifying. As soon as they finished their chant, one of them abruptly turned toward my hiding spot. For a moment, her face lost all human resemblance. The nightmare was just beginning. I struggled to remain still, but the air in that place felt heavy, as if it was pressing against the floor. The nun advanced slowly toward me. Her eyes emitted no light, only a deep void that seemed to stretch beyond her flesh. She stopped just a few steps away. She tilted her head slightly and displayed a smile that was not truly a smile. It was an attempt to mimic humanity, but it lacked understanding. I felt a chilling certainty she was aware of my presence. The Mother Superior raised her hand and the nun before me froze. After a few moments, they turned back to the book. The dimness in the room seemed to deepen around them, swallowing the last traces of light. I gripped the crucifix in my pocket and began to retreat slowly. Each step became more difficult, as if a supernatural force was trying to keep me there. Fear pounded in my chest, but I focused all my energy on leaving the room unnoticed. As soon as I crossed the doorway, I carefully closed the door and hurried down the corridor. That night, I knelt in my room and prayed. My mind was in turmoil, trying to decipher what I had witnessed. Those women were not merely defiled nuns. There was something deeper and ancient controlling that monastery. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I carefully observed each of them. During breakfast, the Mother Superior gave me a prolonged look. I knew there was something suspicious in her intentions. I decided it was time to leave. I gathered my belongings and went to the Mother Superior to inform her of my departure. She did not seem surprised. She merely tilted her head slightly and said, "Do not worry, Father. You will return when you are called." I left the monastery without looking back, but deep down, I knew her words carried an undeniable truth. Weeks passed. I did my best to maintain my routine at the parish to which I was transferred, but the feeling that I was not alone persisted. Objects shifted places and the wind carried impossible whispers. One night, I received a letter with no sender. Inside the envelope, there was a piece of black fabric, identical to a nun's habit. The terror did not subside in the days that followed. Convinced that the letter was a provocation, I tried to ignore it, but the signs became more evident. The crucifix on the wall would fall for no reason. My room would become inexplicably cold even on the hottest days. The feeling of being watched was constant, though I tried to ignore it. During a nighttime mass, something strange happened while I was distributing communion. A woman stopped before me. Her eyes were deep, her skin excessively pale. As I extended the host, a subtle smile appeared on her lips. "You shouldn't have returned," she whispered, almost inaudibly. Before I could offer any response, she turned and walked away. After the mass, I searched for her, but no one could tell me her identity. I decided it was imperative to get answers. I returned to the monastery, accompanied by an older priest whom I trusted completely. When we arrived, we found the place completely abandoned. No sign of life remained, but as we crossed the gates, I sensed that something still inhabited that space. The chapel was in a dire state, the altar destroyed, and strange markings adorned the floor. A foul odor lingered. We walked through the corridors in silence, alert to every sound. When we reached the hall where I had seen the book, all we found were ashes. Someone had tried to erase any trace of what had happened there. It was at that moment that we heard slow, dragging footsteps approaching from the corridor. I glanced at my companion and saw that he was just as pale as I was. The lantern in his hand visibly trembled. The sound grew closer. The darkness at the end of the corridor seemed to shift. Something, or someone, was still there. Without thinking twice, we began to pray. The environment around us changed. The air grew dense, thick with an unseen presence. The walls vibrated softly as if the very structure of the monastery had come to life. The noise stopped, but we knew we were not alone. We left that place without looking back. Silence followed us the entire way home. Neither of us spoke of what we had witnessed, but we both understood that even with the monastery deserted, this was not over. And perhaps it never would be. Everything began on an ordinary night. I was already used to assisting at Mass, organizing vestments, but that week something changed. Father Edward, who had always been calm, began acting strangely. He used to close the church at 10 p.m., but in recent days he had been staying much later. One time I asked what he had been doing, and he smiled, mentioning that he was dedicating more time to his prayers. I didn't think much of it. However, one night as I finished arranging the pews, I heard a sound coming from the back room. It was a soft murmur, almost like a prayer, but there was something off about it. It was Latin, but a distorted Latin. That night, curiosity got the best of me. When everyone had left, I decided to stay behind, cleaning a little longer and waiting for the priest to finish whatever he was doing. The chapel's lighting had dimmed. Only the altar candles provided a faint glow. It was a little past midnight when the sound became more audible. The words that had been indistinct now resounded with greater intensity. Without understanding what was happening, I approached the door leading to the back room. I peeked through the edge of the door, and the scene I witnessed left me breathless. There was Father Edward, kneeling on the floor, drawing symbols. Something glowing lay beneath his feet. They were not religious symbols. On the contrary, they had a strange appearance, as if each line of the drawing carried a hidden meaning. I had read many books in the parish's modest library, but nothing I saw was familiar to me. The priest was deeply immersed in his concentration, repeating those enigmatic words. The room was filled with black candles, a sight I had never before seen inside the church. I thought about leaving, but my feet seemed glued to the floor as if an invisible force compelled me to stay. Suddenly, he lifted his head as though he had sensed my presence, though he did not look directly at me. I remained frozen, watching his every movement. Calmly, he stood up, picked up a small object wrapped in a red cloth, and placed it at the center of the symbols. What happened next was more terrifying than anything I could have ever imagined. The priest carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing a human skull, too small to belong to an adult. A wave of paralysis washed over me. I could never have imagined what he was about to do with it. With unsettling calm, he positioned the skull at the center of the circle, and as he did, the candles burned even brighter. The shadows on the walls twisted in a peculiar way, as if they had come to life. I wanted to run, longed to escape that place, but my will was sealed. It was as though an unseen force held me captive, forcing me to witness what was about to unfold. My beliefs were challenged by that vision. Father Edward, who had always been a source of spiritual guidance for all of us, now stood before an unfathomable reality. He began to speak again, but his words now carried a different weight, more resolute, almost like a conjuration. The walls seemed to close in, and the air in the room became thick and oppressive. The shadows, which had once floated gently, now appeared to encircle the circle as if they were part of some ritual. He raised his hands, his eyes fixed on the skull, and his expression was transformed. A face of intense concentration, but also something beyond words. It was as if the man I knew had disappeared. Suddenly, the floor of the room trembled softly, just enough to make me lose my balance. I fell to my knees, trying to be silent, hidden behind the half-open door. The priest remained still, but his whispers grew louder. The candles around him flickered as if an invisible wind had swept through the room. Yet I felt no breeze. Everything was completely still, except for those shadows. At that moment, something in the corner of the room caught my attention. A figure, an indistinct silhouette, standing and watching. The priest couldn't tell if it was a person or just an illusion created by the light. Whatever it was, it seemed intrinsically connected to what he was doing. I could no longer stay there. My mind screamed for freedom, though my body remained paralyzed. I kept watching, my eyes locked onto the scene before me. The figure in the corner began to move toward the priest, while the shadows around shifted in strange ways, as if they had a life of their own. Father Edward, oblivious to what was happening, took a metal chalice that was nearby and, with a careful gesture, poured a dark liquid over the skull. The sound of the liquid spilling echoed through the room, and in that instant, a transformation occurred. The shadow stopped moving, the figure faded, and the priest stood still. Time seemed to freeze for a few seconds. When he moved again, the atmosphere became dense. Slowly he rose, took the skull, and lifted it to his face. His voice, once soft, now carried a tone that did not match the serene man I knew. It was not anger, but there was something profound and terrifying in his intonation. I tried to step back, but the noise I made caught his attention. For a moment, our eyes met, and what I saw in them was something that would be burned into my memory forever. Father Edward was no longer there. The eyes staring at me seemed empty, as if another essence had taken his place. I remained frozen, hoping he wouldn't act, but no words came from him. He didn't shout or react. He simply observed me, still holding the skull. The room remained in absolute silence, except for the occasional crackling of the candles. What happened next was worse than any scream I could have imagined. He smiled. Not a welcoming smile, but one that immediately filled me with revulsion. Keeping his gaze locked on me, he gently placed the skull on the floor and began to move toward me. Each step was slow and deliberate, as if testing my resistance. And I was paralyzed. My feet felt glued to the floor. The sound of his footsteps echoed as the only noise in the room. As he got close enough for me to feel his breath, something inside me snapped. Finally, I was able to move, and, in a burst of instinct, I ran toward the door. I stumbled out of the room, crashing against the hallway wall. The sanctuary's main lights were off, and the only sound I could hear was the echo of my footsteps on the stone floor. I ran toward the exit, convinced I was not alone. Something seemed to be following me, but I didn't need to look to be sure. The sensation of panic consumed me. When I reached the church door, I pushed it open forcefully and staggered outside, gasping. The cold night air hit me, but it brought no relief. I turned, expecting Father Edward to follow me, but the church door remained shut. The silence outside was unsettling, as if the entire world had stopped, oblivious to what I had just experienced. My heart pounded, and I felt an urgent need to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. Yet my legs felt heavy. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at the door, waiting, but nothing happened. Then I decided to walk home slowly, trying to make sense of it all. With each step back, every sound of the night seemed unnaturally amplified. The darkness swallowing the streets, the few remaining lights, everything seemed in some way menacing. What I had witnessed in the church made no sense. That man, who had been an example of compassion and faith for so many years, was now enveloped in something that could only be described as evil. When I arrived home, I locked all the doors and windows, knowing it wasn't enough to make me feel safe. The image of the priest holding that skull was burned into my mind, and I didn't know if I would ever sleep again. The following days were difficult. I avoided the church at all costs, and the community took notice. Some people approached me, asking why I was no longer attending Mass, but I couldn't explain. How could I share what I had seen? Who would believe me? I started to notice that Father Edward seemed different too. When he walked through town, though he still carried his usual calm demeanor, something about him unsettled me. His gestures held a coldness, and I sensed a certain detachment from the people he once cared for so attentively. Yet no one else seemed to notice. Everything collapsed in a single night when I was awakened by a loud noise from the street. I looked out the window and saw a group of people gathered in front of the church. The commotion was clear, there were raised voices, and I quickly understood that something serious had happened. I dressed hurriedly and went out to investigate. When I arrived, I saw that the church door was open, and a small group, including Father Edward, stood outside, their faces worried. I asked a friend what was going on, and he told me that someone had broken into the church during the night and disturbed the altars. The priest was convinced it was an act of vandalism, but I knew it was connected to what I had witnessed days before. The altar had changed. Something had been knocked over, and there was a mix of burned-out candles and a dark liquid staining the floor near where I had seen Father Edward with the skull. People exchanged opinions, unsure of what to think. Some suggested it was the work of a rebellious youth, but no one seemed inclined to investigate further. I, however, recognized it for what it was, a warning. The ritual he had begun was not yet complete. Although I wished to believe that everything had ended that night, an inner voice whispered that, in truth, it was only the beginning of something far greater. That same night, after everyone had dispersed, I returned home. I spent hours reflecting on what I should do. The idea of facing the priest again terrified me, but I understood that if I remained idle, the situation could escalate. However, I had no concrete evidence of what I had witnessed, only my word against that of a man respected by the community. Even so, something inside me compelled me to return to that room and investigate whether there was anything that could clarify what was truly happening. Perhaps an object, a symbol, or anything that could elucidate his actions. Despite my fear, I decided that I would return to the church the next day when it was deserted. I waited until nightfall. The church was closed, but I knew the place well and was aware of how to enter without being noticed. With a flashlight in hand, I walked silently through the streets, trying not to attract the attention of curious neighbors. Upon reaching the side entrance of the church, the one I used to organize the masses, I felt a heavy atmosphere, but I proceeded anyway. The sanctuary was completely empty, and the only sound was the echo of my footsteps on the stone floor. I had no clear idea of what I was looking for, but I was convinced that the back room held the answers. I made my way to the room where I had witnessed the ritual. When I reached the door, I noticed that it was slightly ajar, as if waiting for my arrival. I opened it cautiously, and my flashlight illuminated the same black candles and the circle of symbols still drawn on the floor. The improvised altar remained there, but the skull was gone. The air was thick with the scent of melted wax and something with a faint metallic hint, just enough to make me nauseous. I softly closed the door behind me, struggling to control the fear that grew with each step. It was essential to uncover what the priest was planning. I began searching through the items, books, and candles scattered around the circle. In a corner of the room, I came across an old book, its yellowed pages covered by a worn leather cover. Cautiously, I opened it, and on the very first pages, I recognized symbols similar to those the priest had drawn on the floor. Although the words were unintelligible to me, I felt the weight of what was written there. The following pages contain detailed descriptions of ancient rituals, invocations, and sacrifices. This filled me with profound dread, as it confirmed my fears. The priest was involved in something far darker than I had ever imagined. As I flipped through the book, the room seemed to shrink. My flashlight began to flicker, casting intermittent light. A faint tremor ran through the floor beneath my feet, as if the very environment was reacting to my presence. I had to leave that place immediately. However, as I tried to stand, I sensed something behind me. I turned quickly, and there he was, Father Edward, standing at the door, staring at me with eyes that now glowed in an eerie manner. He didn't seem surprised to see me there. In fact, his expression was that of someone who had been expecting my return. "You shouldn't be here," he stated in a low but firm voice. He took a step forward, and I stepped back, still clutching the book. "This is not for you." I knew that trying to flee would be useless. I was cornered in that room, and the only path was to face him. "You don't understand the gravity of what you're doing," he continued, his smile making my stomach turn. "This is bigger than us, bigger than anyone here. The question is not about right or wrong, but about power. And you're involving yourself in something you cannot control." My heart pounded wildly, but somehow I managed to keep my voice steady. "You need to stop this. You can't go on like this." He let out a hollow laugh that echoed through the room. Stop." His eyes locked onto the perfectly drawn circle on the floor as he raised one of the black candles. "The ritual has already begun, and nothing can stop what's coming." Before I could react, he let the candle wax drip into the center of the circle. The ground began to tremble violently, and a dark light, almost imperceptible, emanated from the symbols. My body froze. Terror took hold of me. The air seemed to be sucked out of the room, and everything around me started to sink into darkness, except for the twisted glow emerging from the floor. Then something began to manifest from within the circle. An undefined form, a shadow denser than any darkness I had ever seen. It crawled out from the symbols, growing and taking shape, while the priest chanted something in an unknown language. His words sounded like a command, and the entity on the ground responded, writhing and acquiring a terrifying form. I was fully aware that if that thing broke free, there would be no turning back. I had to act, but fear nearly paralyzed me. With the little strength I had left, I gripped the book still in my hands and threw it into the circle. When the book hit the ground, something unexpected happened. The forming shadow halted its movement, hesitating for a brief moment. The priest let out a desperate scream as he lunged toward the book, trying to remove it from the circle. I seized the distraction to rush toward the door. I knew time was running out, so I grabbed one of the candles and hurled it onto the altar, which immediately caught fire. Heat and light flooded the room, dissolving the once impenetrable darkness. The priest tried to extinguish the flames, but it was too late. The circle had been broken and the fire spread. I ran out of the room, hearing the furious screams of the priest intertwining with the crackling flames. Rushing through the church hallway as fast as I could, I knew that the destruction of the altar wouldn't put an end to that terror. Upon reaching the main door, I inhaled lighter air, even though fear still consumed me. I couldn't just allow this to continue. I grabbed my phone and, with trembling hands, dialed the police, no longer caring what they might think. When I explained what had happened, they hesitated, but the desperation in my voice convinced them to send someone immediately. I returned home, burdened by the weight of what I had done. The fire in the church could be considered an accident, but I knew the truth. I was fully aware that what had happened there wouldn't end so easily. When the police arrived, they found the altar in flames, the symbols ruined, and, to my surprise, Father Edward's body lying at the center of the circle. There was no trace of the shadow or anything else I had seen emerge. Only him, alone, as if he had perished fighting to complete the ritual I had put an end to. The police conducted their investigation, but they were never able to uncover what truly happened. As the days passed, rumors spread throughout the town. The church was closed, and no one seemed to know for certain what had taken place. However, for me, the fear persisted. I was fully aware that even with the priest dead, something far greater was at play. The ritual had been interrupted, but not eradicated. The book I found, the symbols he had drawn, everything was part of something much deeper, something I still couldn't fully comprehend. I spent days searching for more information, but the more I dug, the more I realized I was treading dangerous waters. That was when I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I left town, carrying with me the weight of what I had witnessed. I never shared with anyone what truly happened that night, not even with the police. What was at stake was far more significant than a mere crime. I knew that the entity the priest had tried to summon was still out there, somewhere. The darkness I had witnessed had not vanished. It had merely retreated. For now. I left the town and severed all ties with that church, but the fear never abandoned me. Every night as I close my eyes, it feels as if something remains unfinished. Decades later, I made the decision to share my story. Not because I wish to warn others, but because it is imperative that someone knows. No matter how much I try to move on, what I witnessed in that church has never let me go. Even now, as I write these words, I can still feel the weight of that night. The ritual was never completed, and the evil the priest brought forth still lurks, waiting for the right moment. Though I managed to escape for now, I know it is coming. The fire erased the evidence. However, what was awakened in that room cannot be so easily destroyed. If you are hearing this, be cautious. That book, those words, they still exist somewhere. I left it behind. But I know that eventually someone will find it again. And when that happens, the evil that nearly broke free that night may finally resume what was interrupted. I'm not asking you to believe me. I only ask that if you ever come across something similar, run. Do not attempt to face what lies beyond understanding. Darkness has many faces, and sometimes it appears in the form of those we trust.